August 14th, 2023. South side of Chicago, Illinois. A demolition crew was working on tearing down a deteriorating four-story brick building that had stood since the 1920s. The building, located on a corner lot in a neighborhood that had seen better days, was scheduled for demolition to make way for new mixed-use development. The structure had been vacant for over a decade, its windows boarded up, its facade crumbling, a relic of Chicago's past slowly surrendering to time and neglect. The building had an interesting history, though few people in 2023 remembered or cared. It had been constructed in 1921 during Prohibition as a legitimate wholesale warehouse. But like many buildings of that era in Chicago, its true purpose was different from what official records showed. The basement level had operated as a speakeasy, an illegal bar serving alcohol during the years when the 18th Amendment made alcohol sale and consumption illegal throughout the United States. Chicago during Prohibition was notorious for speakeasies, organized crime, and the violence that accompanied the illegal alcohol trade. The basement of this particular building had been one of hundreds of such establishments, a place where customers descended narrow stairs to drink bootleg liquor while lookouts watched for police raids. The speakeasy had operated from 1921 until Prohibition's repeal in 1933, after which the building was converted to various legitimate uses over the decades. By August 2023, the building was simply an obstacle to be removed. The demolition contract had been awarded to Midwest Demolition Services, a company with 30 years of experience tearing down old Chicago structures. The crew was led by foreman James Martinez, who'd overseen hundreds of demolition projects throughout the city. The demolition process for a building like this was systematic. First, the interior was gutted, any salvageable materials removed, hazardous substances like asbestos properly abated, utilities disconnected. Then the structure was taken down floor by floor from top to bottom. Finally, the basement level would be excavated and filled, preparing the site for new construction. On August 14th, the crew had reached the basement excavation phase. The upper floors had been demolished, their debris hauled away. What remained was the building's foundation and the basement level, a large underground space approximately 40 feet by 60 feet, with brick walls and a concrete floor that had been poured over the original dirt floor decades earlier. The excavation plan called for removing the concrete floor, digging down approximately 8 to 10 feet to remove the old foundation, and then filling the excavated space with clean fill to create a stable base for new construction. Carlos Rodriguez, operating a large excavator, was systematically breaking through the concrete floor and digging out the dirt beneath. Around 2:15 p.m., Carlos was working in the northeast corner of the basement when his excavator bucket struck something that wasn't dirt. The resistance was wrong, too solid, too metallic. Carlos stopped, repositioned the excavator, and tried again from a different angle. Same result. There was something large and solid buried approximately 8 feet below the original basement floor level. Carlos called James Martinez over. Both men examined the situation. The excavator had scraped away enough dirt to reveal what appeared to be metal. Corroded, rusted, but definitely manufactured metal. Not natural rock or old foundation material. Could be an old fuel tank, James suggested. These old buildings sometimes had heating oil tanks buried in the basement. But as Carlos carefully scraped away more dirt, what emerged wasn't shaped like a fuel tank. It was curved, with what appeared to be chrome trim. And was that a headlight? Over the next 30 minutes, Carlos worked with extreme care, using the excavator like a surgeon's scalpel to remove dirt without damaging whatever was buried. As more was revealed, the impossible became undeniable. They were uncovering an automobile, a large automobile, buried approximately 8 feet deep beneath what had been the basement floor of a building constructed in 1921. By 3 p.m., enough had been exposed to identify the vehicle. A Cadillac, based on the distinctive styling. The RTV chrome trim, though heavily corroded and tarnished, was recognizable. The massive size, Cadillacs of the early 1960s were enormous vehicles, was evident even partially buried. The color appeared to have been black, though decades underground had turned the paint to a mottled mixture of rust and corrosion. James immediately stopped all work and called the project supervisor, who called the property owner, who called the Chicago Police Department. By 4 p.m., police officers and detectives were on site examining the bizarre discovery. By 5 p.m., the decision was made to fully excavate the vehicle carefully to preserve potential evidence. The full excavation took 2 additional days, conducted with archaeological precision. The Cadillac was oriented facing east, nose slightly down, as if it had been driven or pushed into a pit. The burial pit was approximately 15 feet long, 10 feet wide, and 10 feet deep, large enough to accommodate the massive vehicle with room around it for fill dirt. As the dirt was removed layer by layer, the full horror of the discovery became apparent. This wasn't just a buried car. Through the windshield, which was cracked but not completely shattered, human skeletal remains were visible in the driver's seat. And the windshield showed multiple impact points, circular holes surrounded by spiderweb cracks that looked disturbingly like bullet holes. The scene that emerged over those 2 days of careful excavation was both fascinating and grim. The Cadillac Eldorado, once a symbol of luxury and success, now looked like something excavated from an archaeological dig. The black paint had mostly corroded away, leaving rust-brown metal. Chrome trim that had once gleamed now showed only traces of its former brilliance beneath layers of corrosion. The tires had long since rotted away, leaving only corroded steel wheels. But despite 60 years underground, the basic structure of the vehicle remained recognizable. The pow, massive body, the distinctive tail fins that characterized early 1960s Cadillac design, the long hood, all were still identifiable. The interior, visible through windows and the partially open driver's door that had been forced during excavation, showed severe deterioration but hadn't completely disintegrated. And in the driver's seat, held in position by a deteriorated seat belt, sat a human skeleton. The skeleton was largely complete, though some smaller bones were missing or displaced. The skull showed what appeared to be a hole in the left temple area, a perfect circle approximately 1 centimeter in diameter with radiating fracture lines. The rib cage showed additional damage consistent with projectile impacts. The skeleton bore remnants of clothing, metal buttons, a corroded zipper, and a belt buckle that indicated the person had been wearing formal attire when they died, though the fabric itself had mostly decomposed after 6 decades in soil. On the skeletal feet were the corroded metal eyelets and remnants of leather soles that had once been dress shoes. On the left hand's 4th finger was a gold ring that had survived the years perfectly due to gold's resistance to corrosion. On the left wrist were the severely corroded remains of what had been a watch, its metal band and case still present, though the mechanism had long since ceased functioning. The vehicle's license plate, though heavily corroded, was still partially legible. Forensic photography and digital enhancement would eventually reveal the numbers and confirm the vehicle was registered to Andrew Michael Johnson with a Chicago South Side address. The registration had been valid through December 1963, but had never been renewed. In the area where the skeleton's jacket pocket would have been, investigators found the corroded metal clasp and corner reinforcements of what had been a wallet. The leather itself had deteriorated to fragments barely more substantial than soil, but within those remains were items that had partially survived burial. Fragments of a driver's license, the plastic severely degraded and cracked, with most of the photograph rendered unrecognizable by moisture damage, showed portions of text that were still barely legible through careful examination and digital enhancement. The name Andrew and Johnson could be discerned, along with partial address information and what appeared to be May and 1915 from a birth date. The remnants also included the metal thread remnants and corner fragments of what had been paper currency, too degraded from 60 years of soil moisture to determine the original denomination or amount, but indicating the wallet had contained money when buried. Before we continue with this investigation, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened in June 1963 involves Chicago's organized crime underworld, a powerful mob boss who controlled significant territory and a disappearance that was never solved despite intense FBI investigation. By the end, you'll understand how a man and his Cadillac vanished and why it took 60 years to find them. The questions investigators faced were both fascinating and grim. How did Andrew Johnson and his Cadillac end up buried 8 feet deep beneath a speakeasy basement? Who had the resources and connections to execute such an elaborate burial? And could a 60-year-old organized crime murder possibly be solved when everyone involved was likely deceased? Andrew Michael Johnson was 48 years old in June 1963, a powerful figure in Chicago's organized crime hierarchy who controlled significant criminal operations on the city's south side. He stood 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed approximately 240 pounds, a large, physically imposing man whose presence commanded attention and respect. His hair was dark brown with gray beginning to show at the temples. His eyes were brown, described by those who knew him as cold and calculating when conducting business, but warm when interacting with family. Andrew dressed expensively and impeccably. He favored custom-tailored suits made by a tailor on Michigan Avenue, silk ties, and highly polished leather shoes. He wore a gold Rolex watch and a gold ring with a diamond. He drove a 1962 Cadillac Eldorado in black, the largest, most luxurious car Cadillac manufactured that year, a vehicle that cost more than most people's annual income, and that announced its owner's wealth and status to everyone who saw it. Andrew had been born in May 1915 on Chicago's near west side in a neighborhood heavily populated by Italian immigrants. His family name had originally been Giordano, but his father had Americanized it to Johnson shortly after arriving in the United States, believing that an English-sounding name would provide better opportunities in America. Andrew grew up speaking both Italian and English, immersed in the immigrant community that produced many of Chicago's organized crime figures. The Chicago of Andrew's youth in the 1920s and 30s was defined by prohibition, organized crime, and the violent competition between criminal organizations for control of the illegal alcohol trade and other rackets. Andrew came of age during this era, witnessing how power and money flowed to those who controlled illegal businesses and who were willing to use violence to maintain that control. By age 18, Andrew was working for one of the Italian organized crime families operating on the South Side. He started with small tasks, running messages, collecting gambling debts, providing muscle when needed. He demonstrated intelligence, reliability, and a willingness to do whatever was necessary. More importantly, he showed he could be trusted with sensitive information and money, crucial qualities in an organization where betrayal meant death. Through his 20s and 30s, Andrew rose steadily through the organization's ranks. He managed gambling operations, oversaw loan sharking activities, and eventually took control of labor racketeering, extorting money from unions and businesses through threats and violence. By his early 40s, Andrew had become a capo, a captain who controlled his own crew of associates and soldiers, and who answered directly to the organization's boss. In 1942, at age 27, Andrew married Rosa Martelli, the daughter of another Italian family with connections to organized crime. Their marriage was both romantic and strategic, cementing alliances between families and strengthening Andrew's position. They had 2 children, Michael, born in 1945, and Anthony, born in 1948. By 1963, both sons were teenagers. Michael was 18, and Anthony was 15. Andrew maintained a careful duality in his life. To his family and to outsiders, He was a legitimate businessman. He owned a restaurant that served excellent Italian food and was genuinely popular with customers. He owned shares in several other businesses: a car dealership, a construction company, a waste management company. He lived in a substantial home in a good neighborhood. He attended church with his family. He was involved in community organizations and charitable activities. But to law enforcement and to those within Chicago's underworld, Andrew was known as a powerful, organized crime figure. His legitimate businesses were fronts for illegal activities or were used to launder money from criminal operations. His real income came from gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and control of unions and businesses through threats and violence. Those who worked with Andrew described him as intelligent, calculating, and absolutely ruthless when necessary. He could be charming and generous to those who showed him loyalty and respect. He remembered favors and repaid them. He helped families in his territory with financial problems, attended weddings and funerals, maintained the image of a community leader who cared about his people. But he could also be merciless to those who crossed him, stole from him, or challenged his authority. Several men who'd betrayed Andrew or failed to pay debts had disappeared without trace. Others had been found severely beaten or dead. Andrew's reputation for violence wasn't just for show. He had personally committed acts of violence when he deemed them necessary, and he had others who carried out violence on his orders. By 1963, Andrew controlled substantial criminal operations across Chicago's South Side. His territory included dozens of gambling operations, illegal casinos, sports betting, numbers rackets. He controlled loan sharking networks that provided high-interest loans to people who couldn't borrow from legitimate sources. He had influence over several labor unions and used that influence to extort money from businesses and to provide jobs and contracts to favored individuals. Andrew's organization employed dozens of people directly and controlled or influenced many more. His legitimate businesses provided cover and employment for associates. His criminal operations generated hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, equivalent to millions in modern currency. He was wealthy, powerful, and well connected to larger organized crime families in Chicago and other cities. But 1963 was also a time of increasing danger and pressure. The FBI, under Director J. Edgar Hoover, was intensifying its focus on organized crime. New federal laws gave investigators greater powers. Electronic surveillance was becoming more sophisticated. Several major organized crime figures had been arrested and were facing long prison sentences. Some were cooperating with authorities, providing information about the inner workings of criminal organizations. Additionally, internal conflicts within Chicago's organized crime structure were escalating. Territory was being disputed. Younger, more aggressive criminals were challenging older, established figures. Andrew found himself dealing with challenges from rivals who wanted to take over his operations, with pressure from above, from organization bosses who demanded more money, and with the constant threat of federal investigation and prosecution. Andrew's beloved Cadillac Eldorado was more than just transportation. In the high-born world he inhabited, the car was a status symbol that announced his success and power. The Eldorado was the top-of-the-line Cadillac, enormous in size, powerful, luxurious, and expensive. Driving it through Chicago's streets meant being recognized, being seen, being respected or feared. Andrew had purchased it new in 1962 and took meticulous care of it, having it washed and polished weekly, serviced regularly, kept in perfect condition. In early June 1963, those close to Andrew noticed he seemed preoccupied and tense. He had several meetings with people outside his normal circle of associates. He made several trips to New York, which was unusual. He spent more time than normal at his office rather than at home. Rosa later recalled that Andrew had seemed worried during the first 2 weeks of June, though he'd refused to discuss specific concerns with her, saying only that he was dealing with business problems. On June 15th, 1963, ATDE Saturday, Andrew seemed to have reached some kind of decision or resolution. He spent the day at home with Rosa and the boys, watching television and relaxing. They had dinner together that evening. Around 10 p.m., Andrew told Rosa he needed to attend a business meeting that couldn't be postponed. He changed from casual clothes into a suit, a dark gray suit with a white shirt and dark blue tie. He put on his Rolex watch and his diamond ring. He took his wallet, which contained several $100 in cash and various identification. And critically, he took his Cadillac Eldorado. At approximately 10:30 p.m., Rosa watched from the window as Andrew backed the massive black Cadillac out of their driveway and drove away into the June night. That was the last time Rosa Johnson saw her husband alive. That was the last time anyone who would admit to seeing him saw Andrew Johnson. By the next morning, the powerful mob boss who'd controlled significant criminal operations in Chicago had vanished without a trace. June 15th, 1963. A Saturday evening in Chicago. The weather that day had been warm and humid, typical for mid-June in the Midwest. Temperature had reached 84 degrees Fahrenheit during the afternoon, cooling to the mid-70s by evening. The sky was clear with no precipitation. It was pleasant weather, perfect for a summer evening. Andrew Johnson spent most of Saturday at home with his family. His home was a substantial two-story house in DT1, a good South Side neighborhood, the kind of area where successful businessmen and professionals lived. The house had been purchased in 1956 as Andrew's criminal enterprises became increasingly profitable, a visible symbol of his success. Andrew's sons were both home that Saturday. Michael, 18, had recently graduated high school and was preparing to attend college in the fall. Anthony, 15, was finishing his sophomore year of high school. The family dynamic that day appeared normal according to later statements from Rosa and the boys. Andrew seemed relaxed, more so than he'd been during the previous 2 weeks. They watched television together, Andrew read the newspaper, the family had dinner together. Around 9:30 p.m., Andrew went upstairs and changed clothes. He'd been wearing casual Saturday clothes, slacks, and a short-sleeved shirt, but he put on a suit for his evening meeting. This wasn't entirely unusual. Andrew always dressed formally for business, meetings, even on weekends. Appearance mattered in his world. Respect was signaled through proper dress and behavior. When Andrew came downstairs around 10:15 p.m., Rosa asked where he was going. Andrew's response was vague but not alarming. Meeting with some associates. Business that can't wait. I'll be back in a few hours. He kissed Rosa, said goodbye to his sons, and went out through the side door that led to the attached garage where he kept his Cadillac. Rosa watched from the kitchen window as Andrew backed the enormous black Eldorado out of the garage and down the driveway. The car's massive size and distinctive styling made it impossible to miss. Andrew drove north on their residential street, turned at the corner, and disappeared from view. Rosa expected Andrew home by 1 or 2 a.m. Business meetings, even late-night meetings, typically didn't last more than a few hours. By 3 a.m., when Andrew still hadn't returned, Rosa was concerned, but not yet alarmed. Andrew occasionally stayed out later than expected if discussions ran long or if he had multiple meetings to attend. By dawn on Sunday, June 16th, with Andrew still not home and having sent no word, Rosa was seriously worried. Around 7 a.m., she called Frank Moretti, one of Andrew's closest associates. Frank, awakened by the early call, said he hadn't seen Andrew since Friday afternoon and didn't know where he was. His tone suggested genuine surprise and concern. Rosa then called 2 other associates whose numbers Andrew kept at home. Neither had seen Andrew on Saturday night. Neither knew where he'd gone or who he'd been meeting. Both reacted with what sounded like genuine worry. In their world, when a boss disappeared without word, it usually meant something very bad had happened. By noon Sunday, Rosa was deeply alarmed and insisted on calling the police despite the concerns about attracting law enforcement attention to Andrew's activities. She reported Andrew missing to the Chicago Police Department. The responding officers took the information, including the description of Andrew and his Cadillac, but didn't initially treat it as urgent. Andrew Johnson was a known organized crime figure. Men in his position sometimes disappeared for various reasons: to avoid arrest, to avoid enemies, to conduct business elsewhere. But by Monday morning, June 17th, when Andrew still hadn't appeared or contacted anyone, the investigation became serious. FBI agents, who'd been monitoring Andrew as part of ongoing organized crime investigations, became involved. Detectives from Chicago PD's Organized Crime Division began interviewing Rosa, Andrew's sons, his known associates, and they found nothing. Andrew Johnson had simply vanished, and so had his distinctive black Cadillac Eldorado. The investigation into Andrew Johnson's disappearance was led jointly by the FBI and Chicago Police Department's Organized Crime Division. FBI Special Agent Robert Sullivan, who'd been investigating Chicago mob activities for over a decade, took the lead on the federal side. Chicago PD Detective William Harrison, with similar experience in organized crime cases, led the local investigation. Both investigators understood they were dealing with a case where most people who might have information would refuse to cooperate due to omerta, the code of silence that governed organized crime. But they also understood that the disappearance of a powerful mob boss was significant. It suggested violence, power struggles, perhaps a major shift in Chicago's underworld hierarchy. The investigation started with Andrew's last confirmed movements. Rosa provided details about his departure Saturday night around 10:30 p.m. She'd seen him drive away in his Cadillac, but didn't know where he was going. Andrew hadn't specified who he was meeting or where the meeting would occur. This was typical. Andrew didn't discuss business details with his family, partly to protect them and partly to maintain operational security. Investigators attempted to trace Andrew's movements after he left home. His distinctive Cadillac should have been noticed. It was an enormous, expensive, attention-grabbing vehicle. But despite checking with informants, despite interviewing people in areas Andrew was known to frequent, no one admitted seeing Andrew or his Cadillac after he drove away from home. One person did provide information, though it was minimal. Frank Moretti, after initially claiming he hadn't seen Andrew, later admitted under intensive FBI questioning that he had seen Andrew briefly on Saturday night. According to Frank, Andrew had stopped at Frank's home around 11 p.m. and had told Frank he was going to a meeting with people from New York, but hadn't specified who or where. Frank said Andrew had seemed tense but focused, not afraid. Andrew had driven away around 11:15 p.m., heading south. That was the last confirmed sighting of Andrew Johnson. People from New York was significant. In organized crime terminology, this typically meant representatives from New York's 5 families, the most powerful organized crime organizations in the United States. If Andrew had been meeting with New York representatives, it suggested high-level business, possibly involving territory negotiations, permission for operations, or resolution of disputes. FBI agents contacted their counterparts in New York to investigate whether anyone from New York families had been in Chicago. On June 15th, the investigation was complicated by the usual wall of silence, but agents eventually determined that at least 2 representatives from New York families had been in Chicago that weekend. But both had alibis for Saturday night and claimed no knowledge of any meeting with Andrew Johnson. Investigators searched for Andrew's Cadillac extensively. The vehicle's description and license plate number were distributed to police departments across the Midwest and nationally. The car was distinctive enough that it should have been noticed if it were being driven anywhere or abandoned somewhere visible. But no sightings were reported. The Eldorado had vanished as completely as its owner. Investigators explored whether the car had been destroyed. Chop shops that dismantled stolen cars were questioned. Salvage yards were checked. but a car as distinctive and expensive as a Cadillac Eldorado would have been notable even in parts. No evidence emerged that the car had been dismantled or scrapped. The investigation examined several theories about what had happened to Andrew. Theory 1. Andrew was killed by rivals who wanted to take over his territory. Chicago's organized crime structure was experiencing tension in 1963. Younger, more aggressive criminals were challenging established figures. Several informants suggested that Andrew had been having disputes with rivals, but no specific evidence pointed to any particular rival as responsible. Theory 2. Andrew was killed by his own organization for betrayal or failure. Sometimes mob bosses were eliminated by their own people when they were seen as weak, when they became legal liabilities, or when someone wanted their position. But Andrew's associates seemed genuinely surprised and concerned about his disappearance. If his own organization had eliminated him, the silence was absolute. Theory 3. Andrew was planning to become a federal informant and was killed to prevent his testimony. The FBI in 1963 was aggressively pursuing organized crime figures, and some were choosing to cooperate rather than face long prison sentences. But FBI agents found no evidence that Andrew had been considering cooperation. His criminal activities were profitable, and he showed no indication of wanting to betray his organization. Theory 4. Andrew staged his own disappearance to escape prosecution or enemies. Perhaps he'd learned of impending indictments. Perhaps he owed money he couldn't pay. Perhaps he wanted to escape and start over elsewhere. But investigation of his finances showed no unusual transactions or movement of money. His criminal enterprises continued operating under his lieutenant's management. There was no indication he'd been preparing to disappear. As weeks passed with no progress, the investigation stalled. There were no witnesses who would talk. There was no body. There was no car. There was no physical evidence. There was no clear motive that pointed to specific suspects. Andrew Johnson had simply vanished, leaving behind a confused family, frightened associates, and questions no one could or would answer. By September 1963, 3 months after Andrew's disappearance, the active investigation had essentially ended. The case remained officially open, but without new information, there was nothing more investigators could do. The file on Andrew Johnson was stored in FBI archives and Chicago PD records, one of many unsolved cases involving organized crime figures who disappeared without explanation. Rosa Johnson and her sons lived with agonizing uncertainty. Was Andrew dead? Was he alive somewhere, unable to return? Had he abandoned them? Not knowing was worse than knowing the worst. Rosa couldn't remarry because she was still legally married. She couldn't fully mourn because she had no confirmation of death. In 1967, 4 years after Andrew's disappearance, Rosa petitioned the court to have her husband declared legally dead. The court granted the petition. Andrew Michael Johnson was officially declared deceased as of June 15, 1963. The declaration allowed Rosa to access life insurance, to manage Andrew's legitimate business interests, to move forward legally and financially. But it didn't provide answers about what had actually happened. Rosa died in 1992 at age 71, 29 years after her husband's disappearance, without ever learning the truth. Andrew's legitimate businesses were sold or transferred to family members. His criminal operations were taken over by others in the organization. Life continued. The underworld hierarchy shifted. Younger criminals replaced older ones. The world moved on, and 8 feet beneath the basement floor of an old speakeasy, in a building that had stood since the 1920s, Andrew Johnson sat behind the wheel of his Cadillac Eldorado, waiting 60 years to be discovered. For the 60 years between Andrew Johnson's disappearance in June 1963 and the discovery of his remains in August 2023 saw Chicago and organized crime transform in ways Andrew would never have imagined. The powerful Italian organized crime families that had dominated Chicago in the 1960s gradually declined under federal prosecution, internal conflicts, and changing social conditions. The FBI's use of the racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations Act, RICO, beginning in the 1970s, allowed prosecutors to target entire criminal organizations rather than just individual members. Major organized crime figures were arrested, convicted, and sentenced to long prison terms. Some chose to cooperate with authorities, providing testimony that led to additional prosecutions. The code of silence that had once been absolute began to crack. By the early 21st century, organized crime in Chicago still existed, but was greatly diminished from its peak in the mid-20th century. The major families that had controlled significant territory and operations were either defunct or severely weakened. New criminal organizations, often based on different ethnic groups, had replaced some of the old Italian families' operations. Rosa Johnson, Andrew's widow, never remarried and never learned what had happened to her husband. She raised Michael and Anthony through their teenage years and into adulthood, always carrying the pain of not knowing whether Andrew was dead or alive somewhere. She maintained that Andrew had been killed, that he would never have abandoned his family voluntarily, but she had no proof and no answers. When she died in 1992, 29 years after Andrew's disappearance, the mystery died with her unresolved. Michael Johnson, who'd been 18 when his father disappeared, followed a completely different path than Andrew. He attended college, earned a degree in accounting, and built a legitimate career in business. He married, had children, and lived a normal middle-class life. He never discussed his father's criminal activities with his own children, wanting to shield them from that dark legacy. Michael died in 2015 at age 70. Anthony Johnson, who'd been 15 when Andrew vanished, similarly pursued legitimate work, becoming a high school teacher. He married, raised a family in the suburbs, and created distance from his father's underworld connections. Anthony was still alive in 2023 at age 75 when his father's remains were discovered. The building that stood at the center of this story, the old speakeasy from the Prohibition era, continued operating in various capacities through the decades after Andrew's burial beneath its basement. The building had been converted to warehouse use after Prohibition ended in 1933. It operated as storage space for various businesses through the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. No one who used the building in those years had any idea what lay beneath their feet. In the 1970s, the building was converted to light manufacturing. In the 1980s and 90s, it housed various small businesses and offices. By the early 2000s, the building was showing its age. The neighborhood had declined economically. Businesses moved out. The building sat partially vacant for several years, then completely vacant. By 2010, the building was abandoned and deteriorating. Vandals occasionally broke in. The city cited the property owner for code violations. The building was declared a public nuisance. Various proposals to renovate or demolish it were made but never executed. It sat empty, slowly crumbling, a forgotten piece of Chicago's past. The basement level, where Andrew's Cadillac was buried, remained completely undisturbed through these decades. The concrete floor that had been poured over the burial site in 1963 remained intact. No one had reason to excavate the basement. The dirt and car beneath the concrete remained hidden, a secret the building kept for 6 decades. In 2022, the property was purchased by a development company planning to demolish the old building and construct a new mixed-use development. The property's location on a corner lot in a neighborhood showing signs of renewal made it attractive for redevelopment. Demolition permits were obtained. The building was inspected. Hazardous materials were abated, and demolition began in summer 2023. August 14, 2023. Midwest Demolition Services had been working on the demolition project for 3 weeks. The upper floors had been taken down systematically, their debris removed and hauled to appropriate disposal or recycling facilities. What remained was the building's foundation and basement level. The excavation plan called for removing the basement's concrete floor, digging down approximately 8 to 10 feet to remove old foundation materials, and then filling the excavated space with compacted fill to create a stable base for new construction. Carlos Rodriguez, an experienced excavator operator who'd worked for Midwest Demolition for 12 years, was assigned to the basement excavation work. Carlos began breaking through the concrete floor using the excavator's hydraulic hammer. The concrete was thick, approximately 6 inches, and reinforced with rebar, typical of 1920s construction. Once sections of concrete were broken up, Carlos used the excavator's bucket to remove the chunks and dig into the dirt beneath. The dirt below the concrete appeared to be fill, compacted earth that had been brought in to raise the basement floor level at some point after the building's original construction. Carlos was digging through this fill, removing it bucket by bucket, gradually deepening the excavation. Around 2:15 p.m., Carlos was working in the northeast corner of the basement when the excavator bucket struck something that produced a distinctly different sound and resistance than dirt. It was solid, metallic, buried approximately 8 feet below the level of the original concrete floor. Carlos stopped the excavator and climbed down to examine the area manually. Using a shovel, he carefully scraped away dirt from where the bucket had struck. What emerged was metal, corroded and rusted, but clearly manufactured metal. It was curved, painted black beneath the rust, with what appeared to be chrome trim. Carlos called foreman James Martinez over to look. Both men were puzzled. Why would there be a large metal object buried 8 feet deep in the basement of a building constructed in the 1920s? James's first thought was that it might be an old heating oil tank that had been buried when the building's heating system was upgraded. But as they examined the exposed metal more closely, the shape didn't match a fuel tank. James made the decision to excavate more carefully to determine what they'd found. Carlos returned to the excavator and worked with extreme precision, using the bucket's edge to scrape away dirt gradually without striking the buried metal object directly. Over the next 30 minutes, more was revealed. The object was large, at least 10 to 15 feet long. It had a curved top surface consistent with an automobile roof. There was chrome trim along what appeared to be window frames. And what Carlos had initially struck appeared to be a front bumper. By 3 p.m., enough had been exposed to make identification certain. They were excavating a buried automobile, a large automobile from the 1960s based on its size and styling. The vehicle was oriented facing east, buried at a slight downward angle with the front end deeper than the rear. The discovery was extraordinary and troubling. Cars don't accidentally end up buried 8 feet deep in basement floors. This vehicle had been placed here deliberately and concealed. James immediately ordered all work stopped and called 911 to report what they'd found. Chicago Police Department patrol officers arrived first, around 3:30 p.m. They confirmed that yes, this was indeed a buried car, and yes, this was definitely suspicious enough to warrant detective involvement. Detectives from the department's cold case unit arrived around 4:15 p.m., examined the partially excavated vehicle, and made the decision to treat this as a potential crime scene. The full excavation would be conducted carefully over the next 2 days, with forensic specialists present to document everything and preserve potential evidence. The excavation revealed the vehicle in stages, each stage documented with photography and measurements before proceeding. By the end of day 1, the vehicle's basic outline was clear. It was a Cadillac Eldorado, identifiable by its distinctive styling, the massive size, the tail fins, the chrome trim characteristics of early 1960s Cadillac design. The color had been black, though decades of burial had turned the paint to a mixture of rust and corrosion. The vehicle had been buried in a pit approximately 15 feet long, 10 feet wide, and 10 feet deep. Day 2 of excavation focused on carefully removing dirt from around the car to allow access to doors and windows. As dirt was cleared from the driver's side, the windows became visible. The windshield was cracked, with multiple impact points that looked disturbingly like bullet holes, circular punctures surrounded by spiderweb crack patterns. The driver's side window was partially broken. Through the damaged windshield and windows, forensic specialists could see into the vehicle's interior, and what they saw confirmed this was more than just a buried car. In the driver's seat, held in position by a deteriorated seatbelt, sat a human skeleton. Before any doors were opened, the scene was photographed, exhaustively from every angle. The exterior of the car, the burial pit, the positioning of the vehicle, the condition of all visible surfaces, everything was documented. Then, the driver's door was carefully forced open to allow access to the interior. The interior of the Cadillac showed 60 years of deterioration, but hadn't completely disintegrated. The leather seats were dried and cracked, but structurally present. The dashboard was corroded, chrome trim tarnished, but the basic structure remained. The steering wheel was still attached to the column, and behind that wheel sat the skeletal remains. The skeleton was largely complete, though some smaller bones were missing or displaced. The skull showed a circular defect in the left temple area, approximately 1 centimeter in diameter with radiating fracture lines, classic characteristics of a bullet entry wound. The ribcage showed additional damage to several ribs, with fractures and holes consistent with projectile impacts, multiple gunshot wounds. The skeleton bore remnants of what had been clothing. Metal buttons that had once fastened a dress shirt were scattered across the ribcage area. A corroded metal zipper lay near the pelvic bones. The metal buckle of a belt was still in position at the waist. These items indicated the person had been wearing formal business attire when they died, though the fabric itself had decomposed after 6 decades of exposure to soil moisture, leaving only the non-degradable metal components. On the skeletal feet were the corroded metal eyelets and partial sole remnants of what had been leather dress shoes, the leather having deteriorated to fragments, but the metal hardware surviving. On the left hand's 4th finger was a gold ring, perfectly preserved due to gold's resistance to corrosion, showing no deterioration despite 60 years of burial. On the left wrist were the severely corroded remains of what had been a watch, the metal band still wrapped around the wrist. Bones, though, the watch face and mechanism had corroded beyond recognition. In the area where the skeleton's inside jacket pocket would have been, forensic specialists carefully excavated and found the corroded metal clasp and corner reinforcements of what had been a wallet. The leather itself had deteriorated almost completely, reduced to dark organic fragments barely distinguishable from the surrounding soil. But careful examination of these remains revealed items that had partially survived. Fragments of what had been a driver's license were discovered. The plastic severely degraded, cracked and distorted from moisture exposure over 6 decades. The photograph that had been on the license was completely unrecognizable, rendered into an indistinct blur by water damage and plastic deterioration. However, portions of the embossed and printed text remained barely legible. Through careful examination under magnification and digital enhancement, forensic specialists could discern partial information. The name Andrew and Johnson were readable, along with fragments of what appeared to be address information. Portions of a birth date were visible, May, and what might have been 1915 could be made out, though other digits were obscured by deterioration. Additionally, within the wallet remains were the metal thread remnants and corner fragments of what had been paper currency. The bills themselves had completely decomposed from 60 years of soil moisture, reduced to organic residue, making it impossible to determine the original denomination or total amount that had been in the wallet. But the presence of the metal security threads that had been embedded in the bills and the metal corner reinforcements from bill straps confirmed money had been present at burial. The vehicle's registration, which had been in the glove compartment, was found inside a small metal document holder that had protected it somewhat from the soil. The paper document itself was severely degraded and fragmentary, but enough text remained to identify key information. The vehicle type as a Cadillac, the year 1962, and the owner's name partially visible as A. Johnson, along with fragments of an address. The license plate, though heavily corroded and with portions of the paint and numbers worn away, was photographed extensively. Digital enhancement and comparison with records of license plate formats from the early 1960s allowed forensic specialists to decode the numbers and letters. Cross-referencing with vehicle registration records confirmed the plate had been issued to Andrew Michael Johnson for a 1962 Cadillac Eldorado registered at a South Side Chicago address. After 60 years, Andrew Johnson had been found. He was exactly where he'd been since June 1963, in his beloved Cadillac Eldorado, buried 8 feet beneath the basement floor of a building that had started as a speakeasy in the 1920s, shot multiple times, waiting 6 decades to be discovered. The discovery of Andrew Johnson's remains sparked immediate investigation by Chicago Police Department's Cold Case Unit, working with FBI agents familiar with the historical organized crime cases. Understanding what had happened 60 years earlier would require both forensic analysis and historical research into Chicago's underworld of the 1960s. The forensic examination of the skeletal remains provided clear evidence about how Andrew had died. The skull showed a bullet entry wound in the left temple, with characteristics consistent with a close-range gunshot. The rib cage showed damage to at least 4 ribs, with holes and fractures consistent with projectile impacts. The damage pattern suggested Andrew had been shot multiple times, at least once in the head and at least 3 or 4 times in the torso. The windshield and driver's side window showed multiple impact points consistent with bullets fired from outside the vehicle. The glass damage pattern suggested at least 5 or 6 rounds had been fired at the driver's position. Not all had struck Andrew. Some had passed through the car, but enough had hit their target to ensure death. The forensic conclusion was unambiguous. Andrew Johnson had been killed by multiple gunshots while sitting in his Cadillac. The attack had been violent and thorough, designed to ensure death. This was an execution, not a warning or a robbery gone wrong. The burial itself told a story of planning and resources. The pit that contained the Cadillac was approximately 15 feet long, 10 feet wide, and 10 feet deep. A substantial excavation requiring heavy equipment and considerable effort. The pit had been dug beneath the basement floor of the building, the car had been placed in it, and then the pit had been filled with dirt and compacted. Finally, a concrete floor had been poured over the entire area, concealing the burial completely. Historical research provided crucial context. The building where Andrew's Cadillac was buried had been a speakeasy during Prohibition. After Prohibition ended in 1933, it had been converted to warehouse use. By the 1960s, the basement was being used for storage by various businesses that rented space in the building. Building permits and construction records archived by the city showed that work had been performed in the building's basement in late June 1963. A permit had been issued for foundation repair and floor reinforcement and had been granted to a construction company called Martelli Construction. Historical research showed that Martelli Construction had connections to organized crime figures and had performed work for various mob-connected businesses. The permit didn't specify exactly what work was performed, but the timing was significant. Late June 1963, within 2 weeks of Andrew's disappearance, on June 15th. This was when the pit must have been excavated, the car buried, and the new concrete floor poured. Investigators examined who had owned or controlled the building in 1963. The building's owner of record was a real estate company, but deeper research revealed that company had connections to organized crime figures from New York families. The building, like many properties in that era, was essentially controlled by criminal interests. Based on all available evidence and historical context, investigators developed a reconstruction of what had happened. On June 15, 1963, Andrew Johnson left his home around 10:30 p.m. to attend a meeting. He told his wife he was meeting with associates, but didn't specify who or where. He was seen briefly by Frank Moretti around 11:15 p.m., telling Frank he was meeting people from New York. Andrew drove to the location he'd been told to go to, likely this very building that had once been a speakeasy. Perhaps the meeting was supposed to be in the basement, a private location where sensitive discussions could occur without being overheard or observed. Andrew drove his distinctive Cadillac to the building, perhaps parking in the basement level as instructed. But the meeting was a trap. Instead of associates wanting to discuss business, Andrew was confronted by gunmen. He may have realized the danger at the last moment and attempted to drive away, or he may have been shot before he could react. Multiple gunmen fired into the Cadillac, striking Andrew repeatedly. He died in the driver's seat of his car, the vehicle he'd been so proud of becoming his tomb. The killers then faced the problem of disposing of the body and the extremely distinctive car. Simply leaving them to be found would trigger immediate investigation. Hiding them elsewhere risked discovery. The solution was to bury both car and body in place, in the building's basement, and conceal the burial so thoroughly that it would never be found. Heavy equipment was brought in, perhaps that very night, perhaps in the following days. A large pit was excavated in the basement floor. Andrew's Cadillac, with his body inside, was pushed or driven into the pit. The pit was filled with dirt and compacted. Within a couple of weeks, a construction company with mob connections obtained a permit for foundation repair and poured a concrete floor over the entire area, permanently sealing the burial. The plan worked perfectly. The burial was never discovered during the initial investigation. The building continued operating normally, with no one suspecting what lay beneath the basement floor. Andrew Johnson was declared dead in 1967, but his body was never found. The case remained unsolved, and the secret remained hidden for 60 years. Who specifically ordered Andrew's murder and who carried it out could not be determined after 6 decades. Everyone who might have been involved was deceased. But the historical context suggested several possibilities. Andrew was killed by New York families who wanted to take over his Chicago operations. He was killed by rivals in Chicago who wanted his territory. He was killed by his own organization for reasons that died with everyone involved. The most likely scenario, based on Frank Moretti's statement about people from New York, was that Andrew was lured to his death by representatives from New York families, possibly with cooperation from some in Chicago's organization. The execution and burial required significant resources and planning, suggesting it was sanctioned at high levels of organized crime. For Andrew's family, the discovery brought closure after 60 years of uncertainty. Anthony Johnson, Andrew's younger son, who was 75 years old in 2023, was contacted by police when the remains were identified. Anthony, who'd been 15 when his father disappeared, had spent his entire adult life not knowing what had happened. Now, finally, he had answers. Not complete answers, not names of the guilty, but at least he knew his father was dead, knew generally how he'd died, and could finally properly bury him. Andrew's grandchildren, Michael and Anthony's children who'd never known their grandfather, except as a mysterious figure who'd vanished in 1963, attended the examination of the burial site. Seeing the Cadillac excavated, seeing the forensic work, made real a story that had been almost mythical in family lore. Andrew Johnson's remains were released to the family in September 2023. On September 30th, 60 years and approximately 3 months after his murder, Andrew was buried in a Chicago cemetery, in a plot next to Rosa, his wife, who'd died in 1992. Finally, After 6 decades separated by mystery and concrete, they were together again. The gravestone erected for Andrew acknowledged his life and the strange circumstances of his death. Andrew Michael Johnson, 1915–1963, found after 60 years, finally at rest. The Cadillac Eldorado that had been Andrew's tomb was carefully extracted from the pit and removed to a police facility. After forensic examination was complete, the car was preserved as a historical artifact. The Chicago History Museum expressed interest in displaying it as part of an exhibit on Chicago's organized crime history. The building where Andrew had been buried continued its transformation. Demolition was completed, and the site was prepared for new development. The basement where Andrew's Cadillac had been hidden for 60 years was excavated and filled, erasing the last physical traces of the burial. But the story would not be forgotten. So what really happened to Andrew Johnson on June 15, 1963? Based on available evidence, we know he drove to a meeting that was actually a death trap. We know he was shot multiple times in his Cadillac. We know his car and body were buried 8 feet deep beneath a basement floor and concealed under concrete. We know the burial remained hidden for 60 years until modern demolition accidentally revealed it. What we cannot know with certainty is who specifically ordered his death or carried it out. Those details died with everyone involved decades ago. We can only determine that someone with significant resources and connections to organized crime committed the murder and successfully concealed it for 6 decades. Andrew Johnson's story reminds us that cities hide secrets beneath their surfaces, that ground can conceal truths for generations, and that sometimes construction and development reveal mysteries that seemed permanently buried. It reminds us of Chicago's dark history, when organized crime controlled significant territory and violence was a tool of business. It reminds us that justice, even delayed by 60 years, can eventually be served through simply learning the truth. After 60 years buried beneath concrete and dirt, Andrew Johnson has been brought into the light. His family finally knows what happened. His grave is finally occupied. The mob boss who drove away in his Cadillac on a June evening in 1963, who was murdered in that car and buried with it, has been found and laid to rest. The concrete and earth that were meant to hide him forever eventually gave up their secret. And Chicago gave up one more of its buried truths. Rest in peace, Andrew Michael Johnson. Your long wait in that buried Cadillac is over. Your family knows what happened. And you're finally where you should have been all along, next to your wife Rosa, in a marked grave, with your name and story known.